just a few housekeeping bits. So please, if it is possible, if everyone could keep themselves muted during the talk. And at the end, there will be a Q&A where you can use the Zoom function to raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And you can ask a question, or if you like, you can ask a question in the chat either at the end or during the talk, and we will, my colleague Amanda will read those out. If you do, as I mentioned, if you do have any technical issues, please do let us know and we'll do the best we can. And at the end, and the talk will be available on YouTube, so hopefully that will all be all right. So I'm now delighted to introduce Kensa to give a talk about Henry Jenner and the Cornish language revival. So this online talk links with our current exhibition, Treasures of Kresen Kernow, that explores items in our collection that link with themes of Cornish distinctiveness. So Kensa completed her PhD at the Institute of Cornish Studies, the University of Exeter, and she researched the period 1777 to 1904, in which the Cornish language is widely believed to have been extinct. And her studies were funded by the Cornwall Heritage Trust. And as a former modern language teacher, Kensa is fluent speaker of Cornish, and both teaches and examines Cornish for the University of Exeter and more widely within the community. And she is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Cornish Language and the Cornish Language Lead at the University of Exeter. So we're really looking forward to this talk, and I really can't wait to learn more about Henry Jenner and, as the slide says, his handbook. So I will now pass over to Kensa. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi everyone. I'm going to start with an apology. I have whooping cough. I've had it for about the past month. So please forgive me if I cough at any point and suddenly have to take a slurp of tea. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss some of Jenner's later correspondence and activities regarding Cornish. So Jenner has two periods in which he works on the Cornish language, the 1870s and then the very end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. So it's that second period of time that I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about the published and unpublished sections of Jenner's handbook, his correspondence, and his further writings about the handbook. And then to finish, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jenner's legacy and whether we're correct in dating the Cornish language revival from the publication of Jenner's Handbook of the Cornish Language. So the draft and proof copies of Jenner's handbook are held at Kresen Kernow, hence this talk. The draft copy is a handwritten manuscript, and it contains corrections in Jenner's hand, as well as additional notes. There are some sections of text which are type and stuck onto the pages, and there's two numbering systems which don't match. One's in Jenner's hand, and the other is in a different hand in blue pencil, which I think is probably archival. And the proofs also contain two editions in Jenner's handwriting. There's a comment in the preface about 20th century composition, verse composition, which was a comment made by a man called Dr. C.A. Picanard. We're going to come across him later. And there's also another comment by Duncombe Jewell. And these two men were both prolific correspondents of Jenner. There's also a few handwritten annotations on the proof copies done by Jenner himself, including a later note about ordinal numbers. So why did Jenner write the Handbook of the Cornish Language? Well, he begins the preface to the handbook with a clearly stated aim. So it says, "This book is principally intended for those persons of Cornish nationality who wish to acquire some knowledge of their ancient tongue and to read, write, and perhaps even to speak it. its aim is to represent in an intelligible form the Cornish of the later period, so late Cornish, the stuff sort of from the late 18th century. And since it is addressed to the general Cornish public rather than to the skilled philologist, much has been left unsaid that might have been of interest to the latter. So he's writing for the general public rather than for people who work on languages, basically. And where's this idea come from? Well, back in the 1870s, the Reverend Lax Sharma, who was Vicar of Newlyn even in English, wrote about a wish for a manual of the Cornish language because he wanted to make the language accessible to the non-expert. And in this respect, so Jenna actually writing Handbook in 1904 has moved a long way away from actually his own position in the 1870s, because in 1873, he himself says he describes the language as confined almost entirely to the lower and uneducated classes. You know, he thinks that it's just a thing to do with people from a lower social class that he has nothing to do with. So it seems now, by 1904, he suddenly wants to make the language available to all Cornishmen. And he's decided that his grammar, his handbook, is going to be based on previous work done by Norris in 1860, produces a grammar of the Cornish language, and Edward Lloyd back in 1700, who wrote a small grammar of the Cornish language, but bringing in every form of the Cornish language, so from the medieval period onwards. However, this 1904 book is only based on later Cornish. And what we learn is that the reason Jenner does this, he just uses one form of Cornish, is that he's decided to adapt the spelling for consistency and practicality. So this adds to the sense that this handbook is created as a manual. And Jenner continues that idea in the preface by saying that Cornishmen should learn Cornish because they are Cornishmen. And we learn that there were, from Jenner's correspondence, there were Cornishmen who wanted to learn the language. So on the slide, this is a letter, a chunk from a letter by the Reverend Leverton of Morne Smith, who wrote to Jenner. And it shows us contemporary examples of this interest in the Cornish language from Cornish people. So there's several key pieces of information in this letter. Jenner at the time is in London, but despite that, people in West Cornwall know, rural West Cornwall, know that he's writing a grammar of the Cornish language, presumably through adverts for subscriptions. And we learn of a 17-year-old who is teaching himself Cornish. And this is actually W.D. Watson, who's later a key figure of the Cornish language revival. He's the man who's the gardener of the Morab Gardens. And Watson's age, Watson being described as 17, likely places this letter as being written in 1904. It could have been 1903. We learn there's a farmer in the parish of Morne Smith who learnt from his mother to count to 20 in Cornish. So that gives us evidence of intergenerational transmission, which is really key to language survival. And this is happening in an area of Cornwall that's away from the sort of traditionally perceived heartland of Cornish, which is Mounts Bay and possibly down further into West Penwith. We don't know who these people are. We've got no idea about their dates or places of birth, but I do suggest that the latest that this knowledge of the numerals to 20 could have been passed on from mother to son might have been during the 1880s if the farmer was still a young man at the time that this letter was written. However, it could have also been passed on far earlier in the 19th century if he was an old man. But what we've got from this letter is evidence that there was a cluster of people near Falmouth with enough interest in Cornish to want information about this forthcoming Handbook of the Cornish language. And Jenner concludes the preface to the handbook by saying, the writer had originally intended to add some reading lessons, exercises, and vocabularies, but it was found that the inclusion of these would make the book too large. He hopes to bring out shortly a quite small separate book of this character, which may also include conversations and he has in preparation a complete vocabulary, though he has no idea as to when it will be finished. So the manuscripts for these parts of the handbook, so proposed reading lessons and exercises, grammar exercises, are actually held at the Royal Cornwall Museum, and I'm going to talk about them in a little bit. So Jenner uses the preface to sort of fill people in on, what he's been doing, why he wants to write the book. So he does give us some insight into the delay between his Cornish language research back in the 1870s and the publication of the handbook in 1904. So he says, a few words of comprehensive apology for the shortcomings of this handbook. When the writer was asked by the secretary of the Celtic Cornish Society to undertake a Cornish grammar, which was the origin of this book, it was more than 20 years since he had dropped his Cornish studies in favour of other and more immediately necessary matters. Much of what he once knew had been forgotten and had to be learnt over again, and the new grammar was wanted quickly. So what I find interesting is that Jenner makes no allusion at this point as to the existence of Edwin Norris's 1860 grammar. And, given that Jenner was working full-time at the British Museum at this point, it's understandable that he would have lacked the time to devote to the language. But a letter from Robert Williams to Jenner, dated the 2nd of December 1870 something, it's one with old documents, offers a different reason which might have some significance as to why there was a delay. Williams writes, I have been expecting to hear some news of your Cornish undertakings, but I fear that the want of patronage has disheartened you, and I know from sad experience that those who ought to help you will do nothing. So possibly Williams here is referring to Jenner might possibly in the 1870s have been thinking about writing a grammar of Cornish. And now, in the early 20th century, that the Celtic Cornish Society seemed interested in him writing one that could have finally offered the support, and basically we're possibly talking financial support, that Jenner wanted. And what I find interesting is that despite the gap of over 20 years, it's Jenner who's approached to write this book, to write this grammar by the Celtic Cornish Society, especially given that there's a grammar of Cornish already in existence, Edwin Norris's 1860 book. And Jenner himself at the time names Whitley Stokes, who's a Celtic scholar, Professor Joseph Loth, who's at the University of Rennes, as two men who were far better placed to write a grammar of Cornish than him. Eventually, in the preface, Jenner does acknowledge the debt he owes to the work of Norris, Stokes, Loth, Williams, and Jago, Dr. Jago's Cornish Dictionary, in writing his handbook. And he does say that Norris's grammar has been of the greatest value in every way, and the copious examples given in his sketch of Cornish grammar have frequently saved the writer the trouble of searching for examples himself. In the handbook itself, Henry Jenner's handbook, it's perhaps unsurprising that Jenner includes a section for those, it's called For Those Who Would Try Their Hands at Original Verse Composition in Cornish, because Jenner himself actually at the time is writing a lot of poetry and songs, which I'll come on to. Jenner begins the main body of the text with an account of the history of the language. So he describes Dolly Pentreath as popularly but erroneously supposed to have been the last person who spoke the language. Bodina Thompson and the father of somebody who writes to Sir Joseph Banks, who's an unknown person, saying that his father can speak Cornish. So he cites them as examples of people who could speak Cornish after the death of Dolly Pentreath. And then Jenner talks about the line of language transmission from one John Tremethach to his daughter, Mrs. Kalinak, so they're in Mousehole in the 1870s. And he also says that Bernard Victor, who is also from Mousehole in the 1870s, learned Cornish from his grandfather, George Badcock. So George Badcock was Dolly Pentreath's funeral director. And Jenner says that he saw Victor in 1875. So he sort of talks about I met this man, Bernard Victor, in 1875. But what's really interesting is if you go into the archives, in a letter from 1876 from Bernard Victor to Henry Jenner, Victor basically contradicts this. So this is in this letter, which is in the Royal Cornwall Museum. So it's unclear whether Victor is reminding Jenner of their acquaintance or is basically introducing himself to Jenner in this letter. I would, from his writing here and having read a lot of his other writings, I would say that here Bernard Victor is introducing himself to Jenner rather than saying, "Hey, remember me? We met last year." Anyway, so Jenner concludes his history section of the handbook by saying, "Then it is considered that Cornish as a spoken language died out. The process was gradual, though perhaps rather rapid at the last, and, as far as is generally known, the old tongue finally disappeared in the earlier half of the 19th century. Words and sentences, and even such things as the Creed and Lord's Prayer, were handed on, some of them, to our own day." So he appears to see no contradiction between this statement, that the language dies out in the earlier 19th century, and his own examples of people who continued to use the language into the second half of the 19th century, including his own mother-in-law, Mrs. Rawlings of Hale, and the people that he himself and the Reverend Lakshmi interviewed in Mousehole in 1785. He also mentions John Davy of Zennor, who is sort of known to be a continuing speaker of Cornish, and that he had traditional knowledge of Cornish and knew the meanings of place names and could converse on a few simple topics in Cornish. But Jenner actually dismisses all of this information about John Davy, which is really interesting. The information about John Davy comes from Hobson Matthews, who was a historian from St Ives. And Jenner actually says, "Unless Mr. Matthews, whose judgment one would trust in such a matter, actually heard him do so, the last statement is not easy to believe." So he doesn't believe that John Davy can speak Cornish on a few simple topics. And I think this might reflect some professional jealousy. So back in the 1870s, when Jenner and Lakshmi are interviewing people in sort of Newlyn, Mousehole area, but by 1876, Jenner claims that the outlying districts of Zennor, Morva and Twednack in the Land's End Peninsula seemed to contain no memories whatsoever of the old language. And Hobson Matthews has basically contradicted this, so I think that's why Jenner's dismissed it. And also, Hobson Matthews is an interesting character because going through Henry Jenner's correspondence in Kresen Kernow, there's a letter from somebody identified only as HH, but who's writing to Jenner from the University of Rennes. And amongst other things, he's reviewed Jenner's handbook basically, but he also comments, "Is Hobson Matthews the only man in the world who has learned Cornish by hereditary undisturbed?" He writes in French. For brevity, I'm just going to tell you the English rather than the French. "I am currently," so this is according to Hobson Matthews, "I am currently the only one in the world to have a hereditary knowledge of Cornish." And that Hobson Matthews has written to a newspaper in Brittany to say this, basically. But this HH says that Professor Loth of Rennes University thinks that Hobson Matthews doesn't know enough Cornish to say this, to claim this. So this is another article from the same newspaper from Brittany, the Clocher Breton, and it's written by a man called Francois Jaffrenu. And so Jaffrenu's discussing Hobson Matthews' claim. But for Jaffrenu, he thinks that there's no doubt that Hobson Matthews must be telling the truth and could claim intergenerational transmission as to the reason why he could speak Cornish. But this positive news that there is somebody with intergenerational transmission, that the Bretons are claiming that this person does exist and he's telling the truth, is sort of tempered by the view that he's only one man, he's only one individual speaker of Cornish at this time. There's whole discussions in linguistics to do with it's a bit like if a tree falls over in the wood, does it make a sound? If there's only one speaker of a language, does it basically exist or not? However, a story for another time is there's also the case of a man called St Vincent Allen Collins, who also claimed to have intergenerational transmission of Cornish, and he actually is up from the sort of Cornwall Devon border, so he's a very interesting character. Anyway, moving on from the history of the language. So chapter 2 of Jenner's Handbook comprises a description of the written examples of Cornish from the medieval manuscripts through to epitaphs. And then the second half of the handbook, if you like, is dedicated to a grammar of the language. It includes sections on swearing, prosody, and Cornish names, and it ends with an appendix detailing things like days of the week, months of the year, some key dates, and then he also includes a bibliography of contemporary books and articles on the language. So I'm going to go on, actually. What I find far more interesting is the unpublished sections of the handbook. So it's basically the proposed part 3 of the handbook, and this is preserved in 2 separate manuscripts within the Robert Morton Nance collection in the Royal Cornwall Museum. And the cover page of the first section, which is Cornish reading lessons, includes a note in Nance's handwriting. It says, "These lessons were prepared to follow on the handbook, but were never printed. The chief reason being the failure of the Celtic Cornish Society to keep going after losing its honourable secretary." And as we've seen above, Jenner seemed to want patronage before he was prepared to write for publication. So that these manuscripts exist at all, to me, suggests that there was a plan to publish them. Excuse me. So the pages of the Cornish reading lessons are numbered from 254 to 257, and then 277 to 291. And so far, I've not come across any likely candidates for the missing pages in any of the archive collections I've looked in. The reading exercises include a selection of religious translations and transcriptions of letters taken from the Gwathus manuscript. So the Gwathus manuscript is in London. At the time, it was in the British Museum. It's now in the British Library, but there is a complete copy of it in the Royal Cornwall Museum. And everything is transcribed from late Cornish. So on the slide, here's the contents. An explanation in English on pages 261 to 262 offers the sources for the translations of the chapters of Genesis. Jenner's taken his version of the first chapter from the translation by John Keigwin from the Gwathus manuscript, and which had previously been published by Davis Gilbert in his edition of Grian's Own Beasts, The Creation of the World. But Jenner describes Davis Gilbert as being very inaccurately, and that he's basically altered his version to make it more accurate. We learn that the third chapter is also taken from the Gwathus manuscript and had been previously published by Professor Loth in a French academic journal called the Revue Celtique. But Jenner says that his version is corrected as to grammar and as to spelling is assimilated to the system of my grammar. The grammatical corrections are very few, for this is a better specimen of late Cornish than Keigwin's attempts. But why does he pick these pieces for his reading lessons? Well, I think it's unsurprising, really, to use pieces of Cornish that have previously been translated by other people that have been taken from well-known passages. So, you know, most people at the time would be very familiar with the chapters of Genesis, the 10 Commandments, and so on. These would have allowed his readers the opportunity to see how the grammar in the main body of the handbook was applied to real-life well-known texts. And adapting these translations to suit his own scheme of grammar and orthography would have also taken Jenner less time than creating brand new texts for his exercises. On page 265, there's another note in English about the translation of the second chapter of Matthew. It's also been taken from the Gwathus manuscript and previously published by Loth. Jenner notes, however, on page 267, that the Ten Commandments is actually taken from several different versions. There's quite a few versions of the Ten Commandments, lots of them in the Royal Cornwall Museum. The correspondence, so that there's translations of letters between Penda and Gwathus. They also include phrases in English, which Jenna has reproduced in these reading sections, presumably to assist with the full meaning and context of the letter. The Cornish song on pages 282-83 was written by James Jenkins of Alverton, Penzance, and who died in 1711 or 1712. He's not entirely sure. And the translation of the Welsh hymn Land of My Fathers was originally written by Evan James. And Jenna notes that it was translated and adapted by Jaffrenu in Brittany. And he has adapted it to Cornish from the Breton. Basically, we know that Jenna did that translation because of some later correspondence that he wrote to his wife, Catherine Kitty Lee. He basically confirms that he's written a translation of Trelawney, the Song of the Western Men. It comes out, he says that comes out as a very close translation, but it was difficult to do. The Welsh and Breton song, Land of My Fathers, was much easier. So this seems to be his translation of Jaffrenu's Breton version of Land of My Fathers. So moving on to the languages exercises, Cornish language exercises, this second unpublished section. It's 17 pages long, although page 16 is completely blank. And it's divided into 5 sections, which each concentrate on a different grammatical aspect. So I would say that taken as a triumvirate, the proposed reading passages and the language exercises and the handbook are all worth more than the sum of their parts. So back in 1887, when Lax Sharma's heavily involved in the centenary of Dolly Pentreath's death, he initiates an essay prize, which happens. A couple of men from Mouse will write essays about the Cornish language. And Lax Sharma at the time is going, we need a manual of Cornish. We need people to be able to learn Cornish. And I think that here, with these unpublished sections of the Jenna's Handbook, we can see the possibility, the potential that could have had, because a motivated learner could use the handbook by himself to learn much of the Cornish grammar, including how to construct poetry, and they could look at the 19th century editions of the medieval plays and so on, and also use Williams and Jago's dictionaries to help them. But how compact and focused would it have been to have the handbook alongside some reading exercises and some grammatical exercises, to have the reader, the learner, have access to all of those tasks to be able to begin their own journey in the language. And Nance, as I've said, Nance thinks that these volumes weren't published because the Celtic Cornish Society failed to keep going after its losing its honourable secretary. So what's going on there? Well, this society is founded on the 15th of August 1901, according to a leaflet printed which details its intentions. And its secretary is Duncan Jewell, and Jen is actually also on the council of this society as the Cornish language rep. And the principal aim of the society was the study and preservation of the Celtic remains in the Duchy of Cornwall, the remit of which included the wish to revive the Cornish language as a spoken tongue by publishing a grammar and dictionary of the language, by printing all Cornish manuscripts not yet printed, by giving prizes for fresh compositions in Cornish, by paying a premium for teaching Cornish to schoolmasters able to satisfy the council of their fitness, and also by reviving the ancient Cornish miracle plays, re-establishing the Cornish Gorsedh of the bards. So again, we're echoing what Lax Sharma was saying in the 1870s, publish a comprehensive dictionary in grammar, It's following on from the essay prize that Lakshman makes in the 1870s, but we've got a new further step by suggesting the move towards educating people in Cornish, this idea that schoolmasters be taught in the language. This is a fight that we're still having nowadays. If Jenner's writing his handbook in 1904 as a result of these stated aims, it's a really diametrically opposed stance from his statement of 1873, which was that very little of any importance remains to be done with regards to the Cornish language. So who's this Duncan Jewell? Duncan Jewell, he appears to have been the driving force basically behind the Celto-Cornish Society. In 1901, in a letter to Henry and Kitty Jenner, he writes, "I want to know whether you're going to the Pan-Celtic Congress in Dublin next week. I shan't be going, but I'm sending a paper to be read advocating the claims of Cornwall to inclusion amongst the Celtic nations. The only objection seems to be that there is no Cornish society to take the necessary lead. I am therefore forming one to be called the Cornish Celtic or Celtic Cornish Society for the study and preservation of Celtic remains in Cornwall, including the language." So the society itself is founded 3 days after that letter. So it would seem that the stated aims actually mask the bigger wish, which is to get admittance for Cornwall to the Pan-Celtic Congress. But according to the letter on this slide, it seems that this society was very, very short-lived, because by February 1905, it's moribund. And I think that this could explain why parts 2 and 3, the reading lessons and the grammar exercises of the handbook, never make it to the publication stage. Nance, writing much later in 1934, comments, "It's difficult to understand how a society that started so well could have had so brief an existence," and puts this down to the fact that it early lost its very enthusiastic secretary. So Duncan Jewell. So how can the failure of one short-lived organisation have prevented the publication of this book? Well, it's not all clear, and there are some letters in Kresen Kernow in the Jenner collection, which perhaps shed some different light on the matter. And this is a series of letters between Jenner and his publisher, David Nutt, and they describe the difficulties of making the handbook financially viable. So, as you can see from this letter here, there's a sense that the relationship between Jenner and Nutt was quite fractious. The comment that the existing stock will last until we are all dead is somewhat less than professional. 400, so this is by 1905, 400 copies of the handbook had sold overall, with only 20 of those during 1905. The problem with Nutt's handwriting, it is really, really illegible. So that doesn't help with understanding everything that's going on, but it does appear as if he's referring to the Celtic Cornish Society in this letter, and hoping that it will do its part, and perhaps he just didn't know that it was no longer an active society. And this basically becomes an ongoing issue, the issue of sales of the handbook. So in 1907, 3 years after it's published, Nutt writes to inform Jenner that sales of the handbook have finally reached 500. So 500 copies have taken 3 years to sell, but there's still another 500 copies unsold. So Nutt, as a publisher, with not only concerns about his own business affairs, but also an understanding of the book market and what steps to take, suggests either selling the stock in its current unbound form, so it hasn't got a cover basically, or adding a new chapter to respond to criticism of the handbook and offering it as a new edition to subscribers. What's really interesting is obviously these sales figures give us some idea as to the numbers of people interested in Cornish at the beginning of the 20th century. But also you've got to think at this time about the financial accessibility of the book. The bulk of the sales happen in 1904, which are presumably to people who subscribed, who wanted to, registered their interest, wanted to buy a copy. We've got about sales of around 20 copies in the first 10 months of 1905. And by 1907, a final sort of 80 copies have been sold. Nutt's obviously been told by Jenna, I presume by Jenna, that, or is under the impression that there are numbers of Cornishmen with the means and desire to buy copies of the handbook. This letter from, sorry, that's not that letter. In a letter he wrote in 1904, what's quite interesting is that they've been to the Pan-Celtic Congress held in Carnarvon, which is in 1904, and they've obviously sort of registered subscribers there. But he says there are still some 70 or 80 of them who've neither paid nor answered. I will give them a last chance of call, of course, but if they don't avail themselves of the subscription and pay the upfront fee for the subscription, they'll have to pay the full price. So if sort of 70 or 80 people had shown interest in subscribing to this book whilst they were at the Pan-Celtic Congress in Carnarvon in 1904, but hadn't paid, it means we know that there's some interest in Cornish, but maybe not enough when it comes to actually handing over hard cash. Further letters from Nutt, which are in Kresen Kernow, he expresses his frustration that it's not selling perhaps as fast as he had been led to believe. He says in a further letter of 1905, June 1905, when writing last, you gave me to hope that some action on the part of the Cornish would result in a further sale of the handbook. So far, I have, and it's illegible, and I would say it probably means no sign of such action. During the past 5 months, about 40 copies have gone, in addition to those noted as already sold in 1904. So basically, from the correspondence, we get this overall picture of a fractious relationship between the publisher David Knott and the author Henry Jenner, and poorer than projected sales of the handbook. And a further letter gives some more aspects to these discussions. The problem is that we have is a lot of Nutt's handwriting is absolutely illegible, and we don't have Jenner's side of the correspondence in that collection in Kresen Kernow. So you can't get a full picture of the situation. But what is clear is that the handbook did not sell as well as Nutt had been expecting and was losing him money. So I would argue that these financial considerations, rather than the loss of Duncan Jewell as honorary secretary of the Celtic Cornish Society, are most likely why the part 3, the reading exercises and the grammar exercises of the, Henry Jenner's handbook were never published. It could be argued that an active secretary of a Celtic Cornish Society would have helped to promote sales. It's also interesting that when Nutt suggests adding a chapter to the unbound copies of the handbook and then reselling it as a new edition, they didn't make a decision to include the unpublished bits that Henry Jenner had written. If there were good numbers of Cornishmen interested in learning Cornish, they might have purchased such an edition. That step to actually publish these unpublished sections wasn't taken, kind of implies that the interest wasn't there. I don't know. Okay, but looking at Jenner's wider correspondence, which is in both Kresen Kernow and the Royal Cornwall Museum, you don't get the sense that there's not interest in Cornish. So this letter from Joseph Hamley Rowe, dated the 23rd of December 1903, suggests that there was widespread interest in the language, and he offers suggestions for both producing and marketing the handbook. So Hamley Rowe was a Cornishman who lived in Yorkshire. And he says in this letter he was considering subscribing for 12 copies. He makes suggestions regarding possible printers. He's writing to newspaper editors about the handbook. And he actually says, he makes 2 key observations in this letter, that the Cornish revival is only beginning and wants coaxing, and I think low-priced textbooks are very necessary. So Hamley Rowe can see the potential for a language revival, and actually goes as far as to sort of say, you know, this is starting to happen. He himself says in this letter he'd been inspired by reading Norris's edition of the Ordinalia, of the three plays. But he's offering practical advice, not only with regards to potential publishers, but in making the cost of the revival accessible to as many people as possible. And actually, I did a lot of looking through the British newspaper archives for things to do with the Cornish language in the 19th and early 20th century. And the newspaper from the Cornish Telegraph that actually Jenna preserved. Jenna was very good at preserving any newspaper article to do with himself. Gives some factual insight into the numbers of subscribers. It says, so this is written by Peter Penn. It says, I hope to give a 10th list of subscribers next week. As already stated, Mr. Henry Jenner, the Celtic scholar, has prepared a grammar of the Cornish language, and this it is intended to publish shortly as 3 shillings per copy. Up to the present, 156 copies have been subscribed for. Those who have not yet written to me and would like their names entered for 1 or more copies of this unique work should do so without further delay. So sort of continuing on the same thing about Henry Jenner's wider correspondence, he's got a really wide network of correspondence, and I think that perhaps helps us to understand why he's asked to write a grammar of the Cornish language at the beginning of the 20th century, despite the long gap, the sort of 25-odd year gap between his own work on Cornish. Much of the correspondence, which is in Kresen Kernow and the Royal Cornwall Museum, concerns Jenner's work at the British Museum, and therefore is addressed to him there rather at his home address. And it does seem that it was Jenner's work at the British Museum which allows him to become both widely known and well connected. Most of the letters are written in English, but there are also letters written in Cornish, French, and Breton, and there are many letters on the subject of the other Celtic languages. So if you have any interest in any of those, I would highly recommend looking at Jenner's correspondence. They include correspondence with Professor Loth, who was at the University of Rennes. So, you know, Loth, for example, writes to Jenner to tell him, look, I'm going to publish in this French academic journal, the Revue Celtique, about, you know, the versions of the 10 Commandments. But, you know, he'd be happy for Jenner to publish the rest of them. He also comments that, again, I'm going to tell you the English rather than the French just to save time. Your grammar will fill a gap. It will be helpful to me. And a further letter from Loth dated the 23rd of March 1903, in which he basically discusses some differences between Welsh and Breton, includes the information that Loth's been teaching his students some Cornish. So he says, you would render an eminent service to Cornish and Celtic studies by accurately noting and by a phonetic spelling the real pronunciation of place names in Cornwall. Nothing is more interesting for us around Brittany than the study of the Cornish. I explained last year to my students texts in Middle Cornish, having done a little grammar, and especially having made them aware of the value of Cornish spelling. The Breton language speakers understood at the end of the fortnight the Cornish texts. So if Cornish literature, and by extension the language, is being taught in the University of Rennes in 1902, this both confers an academic status on Cornish and also is evidence of a wider interest in the language. So I would say this is a result actually of the earlier 19th century publication of the medieval texts, you know, that they paved the way for the academic study of Cornish, although obviously not in Cornwall. And a further letter from 1907 from a man called Goblet details the inclusion of Cornish within a series of lectures on the Celtic revival. at the École des Hautes Études Sociales. So this is one of the constituent parts of the University of Paris. They asked Goblet basically to do a series of lectures about the Celtic revival in the 20th century. And so he's basically suggesting he's going to do one language at a time. So he's writing to Jenna to basically sort of say, these are the list of topics that I want to teach, including, you know, did the Cornish language die out or not, the revival of the Cornish language, and so on. So, you know, there is this real sort of, we get this sense from Jenna's correspondence, basically, that there is actually a far wider interest in Cornish outside Cornwall. But it's not just universities, it's not just university lecturers, professors who have this interest in Cornish. One of Jenna's most prolific correspondents in the correspondence in Kresen Kernow is a man called Kensa, who's an optician from Quimper. And he's constantly writing to Jenna. There are so many letters. So in a letter dated the 11th of December 1903, Picken asked Jenna if he can basically get hold of a copy of Jago's English Cornish dictionary for him. He says, I much prefer Jago's English Cornish dictionary. I wrote to Simpkins and Marshall in London, so they're the booksellers, but they don't have it in store anymore. As you are probably very familiar with the bookshops of London, perhaps, could you find me a copy? I would take it even if it wasn't in new condition, but I do not want to pay more than 40 francs for it. So, you know, again, that's really interesting that an optician in Quimper knows of Henry Jenner, wants to get hold of copies of Cornish dictionaries and study the language. So that's Jenna's professional correspondence that's going to him via the British Museum. But obviously, it's not just in his professional correspondence that Cornish comes up. And many of the letters between Jenna and his wife, Catherine, so Kitty Lee Rawlings, contain some Cornish. Mostly, this is confined to salutations and valedictions. And a postcard from Jenna to Kitty, who was on holiday in Chamonix, gives both an example of these and a sense of Jenna's frustration that Kitty didn't speak better Cornish. So he basically says, Cara Holland, you know, my dearest heart, there is a want of privacy about a postcard. If only you had learnt Cornish, how many 2.5 pences we should save. So he's sort of moaning that, you know, he can't write privately to her on a postcard in Cornish, basically. And then another postcard that he sends to Kitty gives us some insight into his work on the language. He says, so this is from 1903, August 1903. I found a box with a considerable lot of notes on Cornish, including some translations which are better than I thought I could do in those days, 30 or so years ago. And also what I'd blank forgotten that I'd even made, copies of nearly all the Gwavis manuscript, which I laboriously copied over again last year. So he's, you know, he's repeating his work because he can't find the stuff that he'd done before. He'd forgotten he'd done stuff before. So, you know, they're quite useful. That's quite a useful little postcard for sort of showing that he really had done nothing on Cornish between the 1870s and the beginning of the 20th century. Jenna obviously famously goes to the Bard of Gorsedh in 1903, speaks in Cornish at Lesneven regarding Cornwall and the Cornish language. And he writes to Kitty and includes this insight to the understanding Breton speakers had of Cornish. So this is in August 1903. He says, I asked for some bread in Cornish at dinner. We were waited on by women in Breton costume and got it. I said, Nebis bara, Maraplek, some bread, please. And the waitress brought it to me. And then he writes to Kitty ever such a lot. I mean, like daily. So a letter written the following day from Lesneven includes the observation. The parson was delighted to find how easily he could puzzle out Cornish. So this adds to the picture we get of, you know, the status of Cornish in Brittany at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a language being studied academically. It holds an interest for certain individuals, like Picanard the optician. And when Breton speakers are introduced to Cornish, they see it as an interesting point of comparison, although the proviso being a parson's going to be amongst the more educated section of society, and so perhaps it's less surprising that he would have been intellectually interested by such a sort of challenge. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because I've just seen what the time is. So are there any questions? I'll stop sharing.
Hello, it's Amanda here. I did see a question, but I think someone else answered it. So Councillor Jenkin asked where Nut was based, but someone replied, or Nick replied, London Fleet Street and then the Strand. So I think that one's been answered.
It's at the sign of the angel, isn't it? I think.
Oh, the sign of the angel.
Yeah, it does say in the front of the editions of the handbook.
Ah. Has anyone got any other questions? We haven't got anything else in the chat. You can either pop it in the chat or you can actually raise your hand or press the button to raise your hand. But thank you very much, Kensa. That was a really interesting online talk. I found it quite
I've got a question if
fascinating,
possible.
actually. Oh yes, go on. Yep.
Kensa,